speaking of loft developments, and we're currently in a beautiful loft development in the West Loop with exposed brick walls and ductwork and timber rafters. What kind of advice would you give a home buyer who's entering a loft development that's a new conversion building, and someone's just walked in the door, the developer is midway perhaps through the conversion? What do you look for as a buyer? What questions do you ask?
Well, I think the first thing you need to do if you're considering living in loft space is, and you haven't experienced it before, or people who think that they might be interested, I would strongly recommend renting a space and trying it before you buy it. It's different. I personally lived in a loft for 9 years. I now live in a house. I wish I still lived in a loft, but with 2 little children, the house works better at the moment. In loft space, you are getting a building that was really not designed to be residential space, but that's part of what makes it attractive and dramatic. But you need to recognize you're buying space in an old building. It is going to need ongoing attention. Those of us in the business understand there's no such thing as permanent when it comes to the world of buildings. So even the sleekest of high-rises is falling down from the day it's finished. You just hope it deteriorates slowly. Loft buildings, you're buying into a building that's further into its life cycle, so you are going to have to spend money every year on tuck pointing and fixing and so forth. That being the case, there are buildings of comparable construction in other countries that are hundreds of years old, so it's not like it's a risky venture from that standpoint, as long as you understand that the beautiful brick walls will probably shed a little sand. If the developer does not take adequate precautions with soundproofing, you might hear the people upstairs on occasion. And you're dealing with, in many cases, high volume space, which requires that you operate the mechanical systems a little differently and so forth. That being said, I personally love loft living and look forward to once again living in one someday. I think that if you're looking to buy loft space, look at what the developer has done previously. I would be, I think, a bit leery of buying loft space from someone who's never done a loft before, because there are a lot of what I suppose you could call tricks of the trade, or things that we have learned through doing many of these projects about the best ways to attain reasonable sound separation.
You rely on the architect's experience for that, Pat?
Well, I think the architect's experience has a tremendous amount to do with it, and space that is designed by an architect who has a long resume of creating loft spaces is more likely to address the issues, absolutely. But unfortunately, at the end of the day, as I always tell people, we design them, we don't build them. So in other words, we can put the ideas out there, but if people don't follow through, there may still be issues. So I think you're right, Joe. The track record of the architect and of the developer, I think, are important. I would even go so far as to say, if you can ascertain who the contractor is, there are a few contractors in town who have extensive experience at doing loft space. And there are a lot of people who don't. It's a little deceiving, because loft space looks very simple. You walk into a big open building and you demise it, and it looks like the easiest thing in the world to do. But as with many things, the devil's in the details. And if the details are not properly executed, it's easy to leave problems that shouldn't be there.
What do you need for a comfortable life in a loft? Floating floors, for instance, for sound attenuation, is that one thing?
I would look to any loft building that is a timber building in particular. I would say that if the floors are not topped with concrete and the wood floors installed on a floating system with padding underneath it, I'd be leery, because it may be quiet when you move in, but when the people move in upstairs, you may hear every footstep. The concrete buildings are probably less of an issue in that regard, simply because they are tend to be massively constructed for much heavier loads than any residential building would be. And so it's less of an issue, but even there, if padded flooring is not used, you can hear impact noises. Women in heels and dog toenails tend to come right through.
Are most developers these days putting in a lot of these things? Is there a fairly good...
I think that most developers understand the need to do this, but the pressure of construction costs, a floating floor system is an expensive system. It's probably $12 to $15 a foot in place, and that's almost double what you would pay to install a system that didn't have all those floating components. So you need to take a careful look at specifically what construction is being proposed.
What sort of heating systems would you insist upon in a loft?
Most loft buildings still use individual split systems, which is essentially the same system you would have in a small single-family home. It's gas forced air heat with electric air conditioning, usually, but not always, exposed ductwork. I would look for, if possible, high and low returns on the HVAC system, because obviously you have a different problem winter to summer. In the wintertime, because of the high volume of loft space and the fact that most of these residential heating systems are designed to serve a typical home with 8 or 9 foot ceilings, and now they're sometimes installed in places with 14-foot ceilings, there's a lot of volume in a loft space. The tendency is for, because there's not a lot of exterior wall, and consequently, even though it's uninsulated brick and glass, there's not a tremendous amount of heat loss out of the average loft. What that means is that the thermostat is not going to demand heat very frequently because there's not a lot of heat being lost. So because the furnace runs for short periods of time infrequently, the air in the unit becomes stratified, which means all the warm air goes to the ceiling and all the cold air sinks to the floor. So you get a phenomenon where sitting down your feet are cold and your head's too hot, or when you stand up it's too hot. The obvious solution to that, as we learned a lot of years ago, is to put in ceiling fans to mix the air, which increases comfort, and they run very inexpensively compared to burning gas. The other solution is that when the weather gets relatively hot or relatively cold, is that every furnace system, even the simplest thermostat, has an on-off switch for the blower. You run the blower in the on position and just let it run, because the blower doesn't consume a lot of electricity, probably about the same as your refrigerator. And the gas burner will only cycle in and out as necessary, but by constantly stirring the air in the unit, you maintain a much more comfortable environment. Also, if you have a humidification system or air cleaners on your furnace, you're also cleaning the air as you run it. So there are some little tricks to living in loft space comfortably that aren't immediately apparent, but it's by no means complicated. And as I said, I always found it a pleasant experience on the whole.